Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thriving with Rachael and Dr. Lou. I know we just got done a holiday weekend, so we wanted to kind of check in and see how everybody did. I know a lot of times holidays, they bring up a lot of stuff, whether it's stuff with family or stuff with health or stuff with choices maybe that we did or did not plan to make. So one thing we wanted to touch on today is, how do you get back on track after a holiday, whether that was you got in arguments with family members, whether you maybe ate too much, or maybe you started drinking when that was something that you were not planning on doing. So how do you get back on track?
Yeah. Well, the good news is that at any point in time, you can get back on track. I know a lot of times, anytime you go on a diet, you have to wait till Monday. I don't know why, but that's kind of the plan, right? I think we need to recognize that we have the power, we have the control to get back on track whenever we recognize we're off track.
Right.
And I think holidays are a prime example of people getting off track. In some ways, I think that's helpful because we can predict it and we can plan for it and we can actually give ourselves some grace and say, you know what, I'm going to go off track. Now, I don't know about drinking.
I was going to say,
if
what do you...
If that's an issue, then, that's a different story. But
Yeah, well, let's look at that, though. What would you say to somebody who's been sober since January and now 4th of July comes? It's a tough time because they're with family maybe, and a family who don't believe in alcoholism and maybe are all struggling themselves and not knowing it. And so you had a plan and it was really hard to stay safe over the holiday. I agree with you. You can get back on track anytime, but let's say, this is the 10th time I've been trying to get back on track and it just kind of feels hopeless. How would you navigate that?
Well, I think the idea of our self-talk plays a big role here. And the idea that it's the 10th time, as if there's a certain limit.
Right.
That if we hit, then, we're failures or something. Right. I think without failing at things, we can never achieve things. We can never really create what is pretty spectacular things. And the more we fail, the better in some ways.
What do they say? Fail often, fail quickly?
Yes. That's the key, right? It's not just failing, but fail quickly and learn, right? From that, let's do something with it. If this is the 10th time, 20th time that I've fallen off the wagon, why did I keep getting on the wagon? What was my reason? I wanted to be healthy. I wanted a better relationship with my family. I wanted to feel better physically. I wanted to be able to maintain employment or finish my schooling. These reasons are still there.
Yeah, but I keep falling into these traps that are not planned, whether it's a bad influence or a tough, toxic relationship or cravings, and it's just really hard to navigate that when that's all I know.
So one of the things that I'm hearing is that they're not planned. They just come up.
Yeah. I feel like that's a barrier for
Yet
a lot
I'm
of
wondering
us.
if there's something that happens in each of those situations that we can tune into and learn from. So, for example, do you start to feel off? Do you start to feel nervous or worried that getting together with so-and-so or this holiday weekend, that it might be harder for me than most? If that's a trigger, then I want to notice that. I want to tune into that. I think a lot of times we want to pretend like there are no triggers, that we're doing fine, and therefore we're just going to stay on track and not worry about anything. Yet the reality is, when you're driving, you have to pay attention to the road. Just because things are smooth doesn't mean somebody's not going to cut you off. You have to be paying attention. Right? So we should always be paying attention when we're going through life as to, where are we going, who's on the road, and how are people driving? How am I driving? Am I paying attention to the road and what I'm doing?
Yeah, I think often we find ourselves on autopilot, and that's the problem. No pun intended with your example, but I think that's the problem, and we become less aware. We become less mindful. So things often seem like they come out of nowhere.
Right.
Whether it's that party and my aunt showed up and she wasn't supposed to be there, or whatever it might be. It could be very real that it was unexpected, but if we're being real with ourselves, life is unexpected, right? There's always going to be something. And not that we need to plan our lives as what's the worst case scenario or plan for all the worst things, but to be aware, to always be aware of where I am in relation to the things that are happening around me. I think that's a key component of staying on track. You know, being aware, like you said, of any shift from content or any shift from whatever the plan was, and knowing what to do with that. So when I'm shifting or when I'm maybe feeling uncomfortable, what's my response that I would prefer? Maybe, you know, this past weekend, I didn't prefer to pick up that drink, but in the moment I did. In the moment, it was relieving. It provides a function for me. The problem is, to your point, it doesn't fulfill those other values that you mentioned for why we don't do that.
And I think, you know, all of this is about thriving, right? It doesn't mean we only thrive when things are going well.
Right.
I think the hardest times is when we're faced with these challenges. And by being more mindful, that allows us to be more in charge of our ability to thrive. And if we failed, if we fell down, if we picked up, now what? You know, I think oftentimes we get stuck on what we did and how we want to berate ourselves and beat ourselves up on that.
For doing it in the first place.
And point out, oh, it's the 10th time that I've done this. And then family members or friends will be pointing it out again. I screwed up. Well, yes. And now what? Right? I still want to stay sober. I still want to get back on track. I still want a good life. I still want to have good relationships with family, with friends. I still want to be able to maintain that job. I still want to be able to be healthy. I still want to be around for my kids. These are all the same reasons.
They still exist.
They still are there.
So I guess it goes back to where am I putting my energy, right? With awareness comes the need for change sometimes. I think sometimes we get caught in the awareness. I'm so aware, I'm hyper aware that I stay stuck in the awareness. To your point, I'm aware that I quote unquote messed up or things didn't go as planned, and I stay there. And it's sometimes really hard to move from that space if we're not asking the question, what do I want? Or reminding ourselves, what was my reasoning behind, you know, doing whatever the behavior was in the first place. We lose sight of that, I think. We get so caught up in the discomfort that comes from falling off the wagon or falling out of this, you know, habit that I've started that we don't move.
And I think that's important to notice that that's predictable. That when we are not tuning in and we get stuck, we kind of go through the same dialogue in our head. And if we can notice that, again, being mindful, then we can alter the thinking process. And if we start to choose to be more flexible in how we're thinking about things and be a little bit more encouraging to ourselves, then we can get back on the wagon. We can get back on track with things and talk about, what do I need? You know, do I need to go to a meeting? Do I need to call a sponsor? Do I need to call a friend? Do I need to check myself in? Whatever it is I need to get me back on track, well, that's my plan. Then that's what I need to go do. And I think sometimes we get caught up in trying to figure, you know, how am I either going to explain what I did? How am I going to, you know, get over what I did, as opposed to focusing on what do I do to get to where I want to go.
Right. Awareness has to do with just acknowledging. Acknowledge where I was, acknowledge whatever experience that I had, and then what? You stay too long in the awareness part of things, again, there's no movement. So I love that idea of not necessarily explaining yourself or looking at it as, you know, having to come down on myself, but recognizing it's uncomfortable. It's not where I'd prefer to be. Where would I prefer to be? And starting there.
How am I going to get there?
Right.
What do I need? What's the first step that I need to do?
Right. So noticing the belief pattern, noticing the automatic thoughts, I think is really important. So when I'm noticing that I'm falling off or falling off track, I'll be aware. Start with the awareness, noticing it, identifying and validating that did happen. And
which is very important, right? I don't want to just skim over that.
Right.
It is important to acknowledge, yes, I fell off. Yes, I did what I didn't want to do.
And I don't want to do that
and I don't want to keep doing it.
Right. And then third would be, what do I want now?
Yeah.
And really being able to put that into action, I think. And something we talked about last week, I think, was having an accountability buddy, whether that's a sponsor or, just a sober support or something like that, to keep you accountable. It's hard to keep yourself accountable for change when most people, our automatic when we mess up is to beat ourselves up. It's almost like we can't let ourselves off the hook, or if we do, then that means something.
Yeah.
And really paying attention to that, I think, is important, because is that making movement?
I think sometimes we get, and sometimes this is helpful for some people, but beating ourselves up is what keeps us on the wagon. Like
that's what we think?
That's what we think. Like if I keep putting myself down, if I keep pointing out what a screw up I was, then that's going to keep me on the straight and narrow. I don't know if that kind of reinforcement works for everybody. I would encourage you to...
I wouldn't say long-lasting is the problem. I think in some short terms it can help us to kind of like snap us into the direction or whatever that we would prefer, but long-term, do you want to live your life just beating yourself up?
I don't.
What's the point of staying sober?
I think that would be really hard. I think that would make me want to go to drink.
That's what I'm thinking.
Right? So, but you got to evaluate what works for you. And identify what it is, and then we need to make a plan and start doing it. And as you said, maybe we have an accountability person, whether that's a sponsor or a sober buddy or a family member, a friend, somebody that's there that is in our corner and is going to help us get back on track.
Right. So I hope you guys enjoyed the holiday. But if we had some bumps, these are some tips that we want you to focus on. And we will see you next week.